The screen glows with a $12 million death warrant. My name, my signature, my life. My best friend Robert just insured me to cover his debts, and the enforcers are already hunting. I grab the thumb drive with the proof, but the black SUV rams the alley wall, crushing my escape. One wrong move, and I'm just a payout. The worst part? My own signature authorized it. Someone's been inside my life for months. The rhythmic hum of the server room vibrated through David Miller's soles, a mechanical drone masking the frantic thumping in his chest. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sterile bluish tint across the mahogany desk where Robert Vance usually sat. David's fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. Each click echoed like a gunshot against the soundproofed glass walls. $12 million. The figure glared back from the monitor, nestled within a life insurance policy David shouldn't have seen. He squinted at the beneficiary line. Vance's signature sat there, elegant and looped, a sharp contrast to the cold calculation of the payout. David's mouth tasted of burnt coffee and copper. He fumbled with the wire transfer logs, his pulse jumping as the progress bar crawled across the screen. The silver thumb drive felt heavy, a cold weight against his palm. He slid it into the port. Metal scraped metal. Outside the office, the muffled chime of the elevator signaled a late-night arrival. David froze. The scent of expensive floor wax and ozone filled the cramped space. He watched the final byte transfer, the blue light blinking with rhythmic indifference. Footsteps thudded on the plush carpet in the hallway. David yanked the drive from its slot and shoved it into his pocket, the jagged edge catching on his thumb. He exhaled, the breath hitching in his throat. Silence returned, save for the cooling fans and the distant siren of a city oblivious to the paper trail now pressed against his thigh. He stood, his knees popping in the quiet room, and reached for the light switch. One movement transformed the evidence into a ghost. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his silver coin. 1, 2, 3. He flipped it with mechanical precision, the metal catching the dim light from the hallway. 4, 5, 6. He caught it on the 7th rotation, his palm stinging slightly. The math of his life was changing. Robert, his partner of 15 years, the man who had toasted at David's wedding, had put a price on his head. $12 million to settle a debt. David felt a cold sweat prickle his hairline. He wasn't just a partner anymore. He was a line item waiting to be cleared from a ledger. The door handle turned. David's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He expected a security guard, or perhaps Robert himself, returning for a forgotten coat. Instead, Sarah Jenkins stepped into the room. Her hair was pulled back so tight it seemed to sharpen her features. Her gray eyes scanning the darkness before landing on David. She didn't look surprised. She stood with that rigid, military posture, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You're late for a heist, David," she said, her voice a low, clipped rasp. She didn't move toward the light switch. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, her fingers subconsciously rubbing the rusted skeleton key she wore on a chain around her neck. David felt the weight of the thumb drive in his pocket. It felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. "I'm just finishing some projections, Sarah. The quarterly audit is looming." "Don't lie to me. It's messy," she replied. She stepped further into the room, the scent of her peppermint gum cutting through the smell of ozone. "I've been watching the traffic. I saw you opening files that don't belong to you. Specifically, the ones Robert thought he hid behind the secondary vault." David's throat felt like it was full of sand. "What do you want, Sarah? If you're going to call him, just do it." I'm not calling anyone." She reached into her blazer and pulled out a small tablet. The screen glowed, illuminating her sharp jawline. "I've been tracking Robert for 3 months. He's been meeting with a man named Mike Davis. People in the city call him the mechanic. He doesn't fix cars, David. He fixes problems, permanent ones. Robert isn't just looking for a payout, he's looking for a funeral." David felt the floor tilt. He reached for the edge of the mahogany desk to steady himself. "Why tell me this? You're the head of security. Your job is to protect the firm, not the partners from each other." Sarah stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "The firm is a building. You're the one who signs my checks. And Robert? Robert is a leak I can't plug. He's sloppy. He's dangerous. We have a shared interest in making sure you stay breathing." The alliance felt wrong, a jagged piece of a puzzle that didn't fit. But David had no other choice. He looked at the silver coin in his hand. If he didn't trust her, he was walking into the dark alone. He nodded slowly. "Tell me everything you know." "Get out of the building first," Sarah commanded. "The air is already changing. I'll send the coordinates for a meeting. Move fast, David. The clock is already ticking." He didn't wait for a second invitation. He hurried toward the elevator, the silence of the office now feeling predatory. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward him, every hum of the ventilation system sounding like a whispered threat. He reached the parking garage, the air heavy with the smell of damp concrete and old oil. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered rhythmically, casting jerky, long shadows across the rows of luxury cars. He fumbled for his keys, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He found his sedan, the silver paint dull under the grime of a Chicago autumn. As he reached for the door handle, a pair of headlights erupted in the darkness behind him. The roar of a powerful engine bounced off the low concrete ceiling, a deafening, aggressive sound that vibrated in David's teeth. A black SUV lunged forward. David dove to the side, his shoulders slamming into the hard pavement as the vehicle screeched past, missing him by inches. The smell of burning rubber filled his lungs. He scrambled to his feet, his mind screaming. He couldn't get to his car. The SUV swung around, its tires barking against the oil-stained floor. It was a predator, and he was cornered in a maze of pillars. He bolted toward the service stairwell, his dress shoes slipping on the slick concrete. Behind him, the SUV accelerated again, the engine's whine rising to a scream. He reached the heavy steel door just as the vehicle slammed into a concrete pillar 3 feet away, the impact throwing a cloud of dust and glass shards into the air. David yanked the door open and threw himself into the narrow, yellow-painted hallway. He didn't stop running until he reached the street level, 3 blocks away from the office. His briefcase was gone, left on the garage floor, but his hand gripped the thumb drive in his pocket. He was alive. But the city felt different now. The distant sirens and the indifferent roar of the 8 million people around him felt like a shroud. He was a ghost in his own life. An hour later, he met Sarah in a 24-hour pharmacy, the bright, artificial lights making his eyes ache. She looked him over, her expression unchanging even as she noted the tear in his suit jacket and the blood on his palm. "You're lucky," she said, her voice a flat line. "Davis doesn't usually miss." "He didn't miss. I moved," David snapped, his hands shaking as he tried to flatten his hair. "Sarah, what is happening? He tried to kill me in my own garage." "It's worse than the SUV," she said, leaning against a shelf of bandages. She handed him a small printout. "I went back into the system after you left. I looked at the authorization for that insurance policy. It wasn't just a forged signature, David. It was your biometric stamp, The digital key that only your thumbprint and retina can generate. David stared at the paper. The code was unmistakable. It was his unique digital identity, the one he used to sign off on multi-billion-dollar mergers. That's impossible. I never saw that document. I never touched that sensor. Which means someone has been harvesting you, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. For months. Every time you touched your phone, every time you looked into your laptop's camera, someone was recording the data. They didn't just steal your money, David. They stole your you. Robert has total control over your identity. He can make you sign a confession, a suicide note, or a transfer of everything you own, and the world will believe it was you. The realization hit David like a physical blow. He felt a sudden, overwhelming need to be home, to see Linda, to touch something that wasn't made of data and lies. He hailed a cab, his mind a whirlwind of percentages and worst-case scenarios. When he arrived at his suburban home, the familiar smell of lavender laundry detergent and old books usually acted as a balm. Tonight, it felt like a trap. He walked into the kitchen to find Linda standing by the island, a glass of wine in one hand and a velvet box in the other. Around her neck hung a diamond necklace so bright it seemed to hurt his eyes. "David, you're home late," she said, her voice light, but her eyes held that familiar, heavy sigh. "Look what Robert sent over. A courier brought it 3 hours ago. He said it was a thank you for the heavy lifting you've been doing on the Henderson account." David looked at the necklace. It wasn't a gift. It was a brand. $12 million on his life, and Robert was spending the interest on David's wife. "Take it off, Linda." "What?" "David, don't be like that. It's beautiful." He was being kind. He knows how much time you've been spending away from home. She reached for her notebook on the counter, the one where she recorded every missed dinner and late night. She clicked her pen, ready to add another entry. "I said take it off," David shouted, the sound echoing in the quiet kitchen. Linda froze, her face turning pale. "You're acting like your father, David. Paranoid, angry. It's just a gift." "It's not a gift, Linda. It's a message." David stepped toward her, his voice trembling. He wanted to tell her everything, the insurance, the SUV, the stolen biometrics. But he saw the way she looked at him, with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. Robert had been working on her too. He had been the fun partner, the one who listened to her complaints while David was buried in spreadsheets. He had isolated David even within his own marriage. David turned away and walked into the living room, his heart heavy. He needed to fight back. He sat at his personal desk and opened his laptop, intending to move his personal savings into an offshore account Robert couldn't touch. He typed in his credentials, his fingers moving with practiced speed. Access denied. He tried again. Invalid credentials. He picked up his phone to call the bank's emergency line. After 10 minutes on hold, a cold, professional voice came on the line. "Mr. Miller, I'm sorry, but your accounts have been flagged for an internal ethics review. All liquidity has been suspended pending the outcome of the firm's investigation." "What investigation?" "I'm the managing partner." The request came from Mr. Vance, supported by a digital affidavit signed with your biometric key. It states that you are voluntarily stepping back during the audit of the gambling discrepancies. David dropped the phone. The air in the room felt thick, like he was breathing underwater. Robert hadn't just taken his identity. He had used it to lock David out of his own life. He was a man with no money, no identity, and a target on his back. He walked upstairs to his bedroom, his feet heavy on the plush carpet. He lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to find a variable he could control. He reached for his pillow, but his hand brushed against something cold and hard. He sat up and pulled back the duvet. There, resting exactly where his head would have been, was a single, unspent brass shell casing. He looked toward the window. The lock was secure. He checked the home security panel by the door. The green light was on, but the logs showed the system had been remotely disarmed at 10:14 p.m. and rearmed at 10:16 p.m. Robert could come into his house whenever he wanted. He could stand over David while he slept. The sanctuary was gone. The house was just another room in the office, and the walls were closing in. "David, is everything okay?" Linda called from the hallway, her voice tentative. David didn't answer. He gripped the silver coin in his pocket, flipping it over and over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He dropped it. The coin rolled under the bed, disappearing into the shadows. He didn't go after it. He sat in the dark, listening to the rhythmic clicking of the radiator, which now sounded exactly like a countdown. The next morning, the city of Chicago felt like a grinding machine designed to crush him. David met his only remaining contact, a man who did forensic accounting for the underground, at a small, grease-stained diner on the south side. The temperature inside was a sweltering 82 degrees, the air thick with the smell of burnt onions and old coffee. David sat in a cracked vinyl booth, his shirt sticking to his back. He was waiting for a man who never showed. Instead, he watched the waiter, a massive man with scarred knuckles and a heavy tactical watch, moving through the room with a strange, timed efficiency. The man checked his watch every 60 seconds, tapping the glass with a rhythmic tap, tap, tap. David felt a surge of adrenaline. He stood up and headed for the restroom, his mind racing. He needed to get out. Inside the cramped, grime-streaked restroom, the door swung shut behind him. He turned to see the waiter standing there. The man didn't say a word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin, shimmering length of wire. Mike Davis moved with the speed of a professional. He lunged, the wire whistling through the air. David dodged, the garrote catching the collar of his jacket instead of his throat. They crashed into the stalls, the sound of breaking plastic and metal echoing off the tile walls. Davis was stronger, his hands like iron. He wrapped the wire around David's neck, pulling tight. David's vision began to gray at the edges. He felt the rough porcelain of the toilet behind him. With a desperate, final surge of strength, he reached back and gripped the heavy lid of the toilet tank. He swung it with everything he had. The porcelain shattered against Davis's temple. The big man slumped, the wire slackening. David gasped for air, his lungs burning. He didn't wait to see if Davis was dead. He scrambled through the small, high window of the restroom, falling into the alleyway and running until his legs gave out. He found Sarah 2 hours later in a secluded park. The wind whipped through the skeletal trees, and the silence of the area felt heavy. Sarah was sitting on a bench, a laptop open on her knees. "I have the ethics review files," she said, her voice more urgent than before. "I managed to pull them from the backup server before Robert noticed the breach." David sat beside her, his throat bruised and his hands shaking. Show me how he did it." Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. David leaned in, his mind clicking into analytical mode. This was his territory. He knew how to read a ledger, how to spot the ghost in the machine. He decided to go through the files line by line, looking for the tiny inconsistencies that Robert, in his typical big-picture arrogance, would surely have missed. He would find the proof that the gambling debts were Robert's, not his. He would find the timestamp that proved the biometric data was used while David was in a public meeting. He felt a surge of hope. This was the math, and the math never lied. He was going to outsmart Robert by being the better auditor. Phase 2. False positive. There, David whispered, pointing at a series of wire transfers to a casino in Macau. Look at the routing. It's through a shell company Robert set up 3 years ago. And look at the date, October 14th. I was in London. I have the flight records, the hotel receipts. There's no way I could have authorized this. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. His shoulders dropped for the first time in 48 hours. This is it, Sarah. This is the smoking gun. We take this to the board, we take it to the authorities, and Robert is done. I've got him. Phase 3. The crack, Sarah didn't smile. She didn't even look at the screen. She was looking at David, her gray eyes cold and unreadable. David frowned, turning back to the laptop. He scrolled down to the next folder, labeled Supporting Documentation. He opened the first file. It was a scanned image of a handwritten note. His handwriting. It was a letter to the casino, detailing the Macau arrangement and signed with his distinctive, angular flourish. He felt a cold prickle dance across his skin. He hadn't written this, but as he looked closer, he saw the details, the specific way he crossed his T's, the slight tilt of the M in Miller. Phase 4. Full collapse. He opened the next file, and his heart stopped. It was a series of photos. David sitting at a high-stakes baccarat table. David shaking hands with a known syndicate boss. David looking into the camera with a drunken, triumphant grin. "These are deep fakes?" David gasped, his voice cracking. "Sarah, you know these aren't real. I've never been to this casino." "The metadata says otherwise," Sarah said, her voice flat. "The GPS tags on these photos put you there. The facial recognition is a 99.8% match. And look at the bank statements, David." He scrolled further. The gambling debts weren't just linked to him. They were his foundation. Every bonus he'd earned for 5 years had been diverted into these accounts. On paper, Robert Vance was the anchor, trying to save the firm from David Miller's secret ruinous addiction. "He didn't just frame me for a few debts," David whispered, the world tilting around him. "He's been building this version of me for years. He didn't steal my identity to kill me. He stole it to replace me with a monster." The ethics review wasn't a temporary lockout. It was a pre-recorded execution. To the world, David Miller was a man who had gambled away the firm's future, used his partner's trust to hide his tracks, and was now on the verge of a breakdown. His death wouldn't be a tragedy. It would be a tidy ending to a shameful story. He realized with a sickening jolt that he hadn't been outsmarting Robert. He had been following a breadcrumb trail Robert had laid out years ago, leading him directly to this moment. He was more than just bankrupt. He was a villain in his own life story, and the evidence was perfect. "The gala is tomorrow night," Sarah said, closing the laptop. "Robert is giving a speech about integrity and moving forward. You're the guest of honor, David. He wants you there. He wants the world to see the face of the man who failed the firm before you disappear." David looked at the rusted key around her neck. He had no money, no reputation, and no way to prove the truth. He was a man standing on a trap door, and Robert Vance had his hand on the lever. The O'Hare Regency was a cathedral of oppressive luxury. The towering atrium was draped in heavy velvet curtains, and the air was thick with the cloying, sugary scent of thousands of lilies. It smelled like a funeral parlor disguised as a party. David moved through the crowd of tuxedo-clad executives, his skin crawling. Every smile felt like a sneer. Every hello felt like a goodbye. He was intercepted by Robert near the grand staircase. Robert looked immaculate in a tailored Italian suit, his charismatic smirk firmly in place. He placed a heavy hand on David's shoulder, the grip firm and proprietary. "David, you look tired," Robert said, his voice a melodic purr. He leaned in close, the scent of his expensive cologne overwhelming. "But it's almost over. Just a few more hours, and the weight will be off your shoulders. I know about the insurance, Robert. I know about the ethics files." David hissed, trying to keep his voice steady. Robert didn't blink. He just cracked his knuckles, thumb to pinky, then back to middle. Pop, pop, pop. "Then you know how this ends. You can go quietly, or we can do this the hard way." He pulled a small smartphone from his pocket and showed David the screen. It was a live video feed. Linda was sitting at table 14, looking beautiful in a soft, flowing dress. She was laughing at something a guest had said. But David's eyes weren't on her face. They were on the large, industrial fire suppression canister tucked under the table. A small black device was taped to the nozzle. "It's a localized gas release," Robert whispered. "Lethal in 30 seconds. Odorless, invisible. If you don't walk onto that balcony when I call your name, if you don't give the distraught performance I've written for you, I press a button. Linda dies in the middle of the appetizers, and the grieving partner, that's me, will be there to comfort her in her final moments. Or, more likely, she'll just be another victim of your unstable behavior." David felt the air leave his lungs. "You wouldn't." "I already have," Robert said, his eyes cold and unblinking. "Sarah is watching her. If I even think you're going off script, it's over. Now, go get a drink. You have 10 minutes before the tribute begins." Robert walked away, leaving David standing in the middle of the ballroom. He looked across the sea of people and saw Sarah Jenkins standing by the far wall. She caught his eye and gave a small, sharp nod. David knew he had to act. He couldn't go to the police. Robert had the gas. He couldn't attack Robert. Sarah would trigger the device. He had to disable the source. He turned and slipped through a set of heavy oak doors marked "Staff Only," entering the narrow service corridor. The hallway was a stark contrast to the ballroom. Yellow-painted walls, the smell of hot grease and trash, and a claustrophobic silence. He ran toward the central server room, his mind racing. If he could get into the hotel's network, he could override the digital trigger for the gas canister. He was halfway down the hall when a shadow detached itself from the wall. Mike Davis stepped into his path. The enforcer's temple was bruised, and his eyes were filled with a flat, murderous intent. He didn't use a wire this time. He swung a heavy, lead-filled pipe. David ducked, the pipe whistling over his head and denting the steel wall. He lunged at Davis, tackling him into a stack of industrial laundry bins. They tumbled across the floor, a chaotic mess of limbs and fabric. Davis was a machine, his blows rhythmic and powerful. He caught David with a hook to the ribs that sent him spiraling into an electrical panel. The sparks erupted, the lights in the corridor flickering. David felt the current hum through his body, a jolt of pure energy. He grabbed a heavy metal tray from a nearby food cart and swung it with a desperate, animal roar. The edge of the tray caught Davis in the throat. The big man choked, his hands flying to his neck. David didn't stop. He slammed Davis into the electrical panel again, the enforcer's body jerking as the current surged through him. Davis slumped to the floor, unconscious, his tactical watch finally falling silent. David didn't wait. He scrambled to the server room door and shoved it open. The room was a digital graveyard, filled with the hum of cooling fans and the blinking blue lights of 100 servers. He lunged for the main console, his fingers flying across the keys. He needed to find the frequency for the gas trigger. He needed to... You're always so predictable, David. He froze. Robert Vance was standing in the doorway, a small, sleek pistol in his hand. He looked bored, as if he were waiting for a slow waiter to bring his check. You really thought I'd let you just walk into the heart of the system? Robert asked, stepping into the room. I know how you think. You look for the variable. You try to straighten the line. But I'm the one who drew the map. It's over, Robert, David said, his voice trembling. The police will be here. I've already sent the files. To who? The server you're standing in front of? I own this hotel's network for the night, David. Nothing leaves this room unless I say so. Robert gestured with the gun toward the back door, which led to the private penthouse balcony. Move! The audience is waiting for the big finale. David walked slowly toward the balcony, the cold air of the Chicago night hitting him as he stepped outside. The wind howled, a high-pitched whistling that seemed to rip the words from his mouth. He looked over the waist-high glass railing at the 1,000-foot drop. Below, the city was a shimmering, indifferent grid of lights. Where's Sarah? David asked, his back to the abyss. Right here. Sarah Jenkins stepped onto the balcony from the side entrance. She had her weapon drawn, but it wasn't pointed at Robert. It was pointed directly at David's chest. Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. David felt a surge of relief. Sarah, thank God, I've got him. He's got the trigger for the gas. Take the gun, Sarah. We can end this right now. He looked at her, waiting for the professional, cold efficiency he'd come to rely on. He had played this perfectly. He had led Robert right to her, to the witness who knew everything. He had even managed to keep the thumb drive in his pocket. He was the one holding the cards now. Phase 2. False positive. Sarah stepped forward, her expression as unreadable as ever. She moved between David and Robert, her gun steady. Robert's smirk faltered for a second. Sarah, what are you doing? He asked, his voice losing its melodic purr. I'm doing my job, Sarah said. She reached out and took the pistol from Robert's hand. He gave it up without a fight, looking genuinely confused. David laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. You see, Robert, you didn't own her. You just rented her. Sarah, let's get him inside. Let's get Linda out of there. Phase 3. The crack, Sarah didn't move. She didn't lower either gun. She stood there, a twin-armed statue in the howling wind. David's laughter died in his throat. He looked at her hands. She wasn't holding the guns like a protector. She was holding them like a collector. She reached up with one hand and touched the rusted key around her neck, her fingers moving with a slow, rhythmic pressure. The key, David, she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Do you know what it's for? Phase 4, full collapse. It's not for a door, she continued, her gray eyes turning into chips of ice. It's for the vault, your vault, the one I've been emptying for the last 6 months. Robert's eyes widened. Sarah, what are you talking about? We had a deal. The 12 million is a rounding error, Robert, she snapped, not taking her eyes off David. You were so busy trying to frame David for your gambling debts that you didn't notice I was using your access to drain the firm's primary reserves. I didn't just harvest David's biometrics, I harvested yours too. She looked at David, a small, cruel smile touching her lips. Robert was the perfect distraction. He's so arrogant, so convinced of his own brilliance, that he never realized he was just a tool. And you, David, you were the perfect victim, so focused on the straight line that you never saw the curve. You're the one who set this all up, David whispered, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. The insurance, the SUV, it wasn't Robert. It was you. Robert provided the motive. I provided the means, Sarah said. She stepped closer, the gun barrel cold against David's forehead. But I need the payout. The firm is empty, David. The only thing left is your life insurance. And for that to work, I need a suicide. A tragic, high-profile jump by a man who lost everything to his own greed. She looked at Robert. And then, of course, the grieving partner will have a tragic accident of his own a few weeks later. A car crash, perhaps, or a robbery gone wrong. And the head of security, well, she'll be long gone, with enough money to buy 1,000 houses and change every lock in the world. David looked at the two people who had been his pillars and realized they were both hollow. He was standing on the edge of the world, and the only person he could trust was himself. The police are on their way, David, Robert said, his voice trembling now. I called them. I told them you were distraught. I told them you were going to jump. They'll be here in 2 minutes. Then we'd better get started, Sarah said. David looked at the wind-whipped sky. He reached into his pocket and felt the silver thumb drive. He looked at Sarah, then at Robert. He didn't feel fear anymore. He felt a cold, numerical clarity. You're right, Sarah, David said, his voice calm. I am predictable. I always look for the variable. And here's the one you missed. He held up his left hand. Strapped to his wrist was a small medical-grade sensor he'd taken from the server room's emergency kit. It's a biometric dead man switch. I linked it to the firm's public cloud while I was at the console. It's monitoring my heart rate. If it stops or if it spikes above a certain level, like, say, if I were falling from a penthouse balcony, it automatically releases every file I downloaded tonight. The insurance policy, the wire transfers, the deep fake metadata, and the logs of your private access to the vault, Sarah. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. Check your tablet, David said. The upload is already at 90%. It's a closed loop, Sarah. If I die, you both go to prison for the rest of your lives. If I live, maybe we can negotiate. The silence on the balcony was absolute, save for the howling wind. Sarah's finger tensed on the trigger. Robert looked like he was about to vomit. In that moment of hesitation, David moved. He didn't go for the gun. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a jagged shard of decorative glass he'd picked up in the corridor. He swung it, catching Sarah across the wrist. She cried out, the gun clattering to the deck. David lunged at Robert, tackling him away from the railing and pinning him to the cold stone floor. It's over, he shouted. The math is done. The balcony doors burst open. A dozen police officers swarmed the deck, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. David stayed on the ground, his hands behind his head, watching as they tackled Sarah and hauled Robert to his feet. An hour later, David sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over his shoulders. The air smelled of exhaust and rain. He watched as the police led Robert and Sarah away in handcuffs, their faces pale under the flashing blue and red lights. He felt a crushing sense of betrayal, a weight in his chest that no ledger could balance. He had spent his life building a fortress of numbers, only to realize the people inside were the ones tearing it down. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed the deals, the hands that had fought for his life. They were shaking. Linda was there too, wrapped in a coat and shivering. She didn't look at him. She looked at the ground, her face a mask of confusion and grief. The diamond necklace was gone. left on the floor of the ballroom. "We're leaving, Linda," David said, his voice a low rasp. "Where?" she asked, her voice small. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere with no servers, no glass walls, and no one who knows my name." 3 months later, David Miller stood on the porch of a farmhouse in Vermont. The air was cold and clean, smelling of wood smoke and pine. The silence was a physical presence, a heavy, peaceful weight on his eardrums. He looked out over the snow-covered valley, the skeletal trees standing like sentinels against the rising sun. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He checked the high-tech security monitor he'd installed, a perimeter of sensors that watched the long, empty driveway. Everything was green. The math was settled. He turned off the monitor and slipped the phone into his pocket. He didn't need to check it every minute anymore. He walked into the kitchen, where the smell of fresh coffee and toast filled the air. Linda was there, sitting at a simple wooden table, reading a book. She looked up and gave him a small, genuine smile. "Breakfast is ready," she said. David sat down, feeling the warmth of the sun on his back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver coin. He looked at it for a long moment, the metal catching the morning light. He didn't flip it. He placed it on the table, a simple piece of metal that no longer held his fate. He picked up his fork and began to eat, finally choosing a simple life over the paranoid, corporate ghost he had once been. The count was over. He was finally home.